Now, I want to start not with unethical theory, but rather with a case. And I think it's a case that can get us into why one might want to have an ethical theory, why one might need an ethical theory readily available to help you. I wouldn't say it will resolve things for you when you have problems, but it will help you resolve those problems. It gives you an orientation, helps you get your bearings. The example is an actual one from the deliberations and conclusions of the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects. And the particular period that I have picked from this example is in 1976, when the Commission was considering the legitimacy and the conditions under which it would be legitimate to use children, obviously non-consenting, even very young children, in research, biomedical research. The Commission found its debate coming to a grinding halt over what it considered, I think rightly considered, a very significant moral problem. How much danger or risk can justifiably be presented to children in so-called non-therapeutic or non-beneficial research? Now, the Commission fragmented into basically two parties during this debate. There were what I will call, for lack of a better expression, I think it gets to the point, the defenders of research and the defenders of children. Now, nobody is not a defender of children, of course, but I think you'll see the point. The defenders of research argued as follows: to severely restrict the involvement of children in research would absolutely bring pediatric research to a standstill, with grave consequences for pediatrics and with grave consequences for the patients of the future. The others, the defenders of children, argued that exposure to significant risk when the intervention is not therapeutic is in effect to use persons without their consent to the ends of science. Children would be exploited without any benefit flowing to them for their sacrifice. Now, the most difficult ethical issues for the Commission during this debate arose with respect to research presenting more than minimal risk. Nobody had much problem with minimal risk, which was defined basically as the risk of a standard medical examination, when there is no prospect of direct benefit, of course, is what presents the particular problem. Now, some members of the Commission urge that the limit for such research remain at the level of minimal risk, which is just to say you can't present more research to children. You can't present more risk to children in your research than you would present in a standard medical examination. Others argued that you'd never really get very far in pediatric research if that were the limit, so they argued for some increment beyond that limit. Ultimately, the Commission decided, with two members dissenting, that if three additional conditions, besides those so far mentioned, are satisfied, then the research could be justified. First, any risk above minimal would be only a minor increment, as it was put, above minimal. Now, nobody really knew what that meant, but the idea was to put it off to IRBs to make a determination of what that meant. Secondly, the procedures to be used must, the Commission said, be reasonably similar to procedures which the prospective subjects have already in some way experienced. The idea was not to put them in a totally new or alien environment in their encounter with the medical enterprise. And third, the research must be capable of yielding generalizable knowledge important for the understanding of the subject's specific disorder. In short, then, what the Commission found was foreseeable benefit in the future to an identifiable class of persons, but where the particular persons were unidentified, was held to justify a minor increase in risk beyond the level of minimal risk. Two commissioners filed very interesting and particularly vigorous dissent in regard to these conclusions. I want to mention those dissents because they will launch us into our discussion of ethical theory. Dr. Robert Cook, who was at that time Vice Chancellor of the Medical System of the University of Wisconsin, objected as follows, and I quote, "In the ethical justification of its recommendations, the Commission can invoke only the principle of utility. This in itself does not constitute any breach of ethics, but it does indicate the perilous nature of the recommendation, and the ethical uncertainty of the commission. So what he's saying is the principle of utility itself is not a bad principle, but if that's the only principle you're going to rely upon, it's a very shaky foundation, and he thought not an adequate one. A lawyer, a Washington, D.C. lawyer named Robert Turtle, was even tougher on his fellow commissioners. He wrote as follows, and I quote, "The Commission notes that it was impressed by reported examples of diagnostic, therapeutic, and preventive measures in the history of medicine. That rationale provides no basis for segregating children into separate classes. The rationale is strictly utilitarian. I do not believe that a strictly utilitarian rationale can provide adequate justification for a policy creating a doubly disadvantaged class of children." Doubly disadvantaged here means, well, you already have sick children, and then you add on top of their sickness some research procedure that puts them at additional risk. Now, one way to frame this debate is to ask the following question. Should we constrain utilitarian reasoning? The Commission here engages in a straightforward piece of utilitarian reasoning. I don't think there's any real question about that. And the majority of the commissioners went along with it. Now, ask yourself the question, is that a good decision? And if that's a good decision, is it just as good a decision everywhere as it is here? And if your answer to that is yes, then it means you're very, very tempted, to be sure, by the utilitarian moral philosophy. Obviously, Turtle and Cook, and for that matter, the largest number of moral philosophers at the present time do not accept the utilitarian moral philosophies, and that raises the question, if you don't accept that one, that's not good enough, then what would be good enough? That launches us into questions of ethical theory, and I'm going to start with utilitarianism, which I describe, I believe, in your outline as consequence-based theory. Now, one piece of background, the textbook presentation of ethical theory until very recently was to say the world was bifurcated into two types of theory, so-called consequentialist theories and non-consequentialist theories. That is, say, theories that turned on whether you reason exclusively by good and bad consequences or you use something else, some more rigorous principle that doesn't have to do with consequences. Utilitarian theories were held out to be, rightly I think, the premier type of consequentialist theory. And then there were a great many non-consequentialist theories, which are often described as deontological theories, though that term need not stop us. The point is the following. These were considered until very recently, the last 15 years or so, the great giants in the history of moral theory, or at least the history of modern moral theory. I'm going to look at those two models first. In particular, the utilitarian model and the Kantian model, the model developed by Immanuel Kant, which was always held to be the leading deontological theory. Then, having done that, my procedure is to look at a number of different kinds of theories that have arisen largely in the last 15 years, though certainly not exclusively. Some of them go back as far as ancient Greek philosophy, and look at them as kind of competitors to these theories. Not because I think you have to pick and choose one or the other. That, I think, is a quite wrong-headed way to think about it. But I'm going to view it for purposes of this lecture largely as here are the two giants, and then here are all these challengers. And the question for you is, do you want to pick one of the giants or one of the challengers, or do you want to say, no, there's something that's really unsatisfactory about all of these, or perhaps even better, there's something that's very acceptable about all of these, and I think I can figure out a way to put together the acceptable parts in a more comprehensive philosophy. Now, let me start, as I say, with utilitarianism. The major exposition of utilitarianism is still today John Stuart Mill's 19th century work simply entitled Utilitarianism. It proposes the principle of utility as the sole moral principle. Mill described that principle also as the greatest happiness principle. He said, actions are right in proportion to their tendency to promote the happiness of all persons who are affected, and they are wrong insofar as they tend to produce pain or unhappiness. It's a very simple principle. Now, Mill's principle and his theory is only one utilitarian theory. There are several other leading types of utilitarian theory. We can't get into the many different types. I do want to say, though, what I take to be the conditions of any theory that would qualify as a utilitarian theory, and I believe those conditions are four. First, You must accept the principle of utility as the overriding principle in ethics. And that principle is a principle of maximizing the good. That is to say, anyone who accepts that principle accepts the obligation to maximize the good under all circumstances, or to minimize the evil or harm that might arise in that circumstance. The idea is to present this principle as a balancing principle. You want to balance so as to produce the maximum amount of good, the minimal amount of evil, and that supposedly is true in a pure utilitarian theory, irrespective of how goods and harms or evils are distributed. The next question that people typically raise once they hear about the principle of utility is, well, okay, I understand that I have to maximize the good, but what's the good? And that leads to a second condition. A utilitarian must give you a theory of value. Obviously they must, otherwise the principle of utility would be vacuous. Unfortunately, utilitarians disagree somewhat over what kind of a theory of value to present to you, and they tend to bifurcate along lines of those who think that values are agent neutral. That is to say, it doesn't matter who the particular agent is, because if a good is a good, then it's a good for all persons, or at least for all rational persons. So whatever things are the basic goods for you are also the basic goods for me. They're often said to be intrinsic goods or foundational goods. Other utilitarians, though, don't accept that view. They don't like the idea of agent neutral values. They prefer some kind of a subjective conception of values. In other words, what you value the most is what constitutes your good. What I value the most is what constitutes my good. And therefore, a subjective account or a preference account of utilitarianism is worked out in terms of some kind of a subject-relative account of the goods. Now, that's the second condition. The third condition is the condition of consequentialism, the acceptance of an entirely consequentialist philosophy. The point is really a very simple one. Actions are right or wrong in accordance with their consequences, not in accordance with some intrinsic feature that the action has. In other words, it's not just that it's truthful or that you remain faithful to someone. It's not truthfulness or fidelity that in itself is something that's an intrinsic moral good in a utilitarian conception. Those become moral principles or moral virtues because of the consequences that they have. Now, a utilitarian does not expect you to be able to anticipate fully every possible consequence of every action you perform. That's an absurdity, of course. The demand is only that you try to reasonably anticipate what the outcome will be, and having figured that out, maximize good and minimize harm or evil. Finally, the fourth condition is an impartiality requirement. All parties in the utilitarian moral philosophy must receive impartial and equal consideration in those circumstances in which you're maximizing goods and minimizing harms. In other words, you can't pick the persons in regard to which you maximize and minimize. You're to treat all persons impartially. Now, that may seem innocent enough, but we'll see later that it raises a number of problems. In fact, each of these four conditions of utilitarianism raises problems, and I want to say something briefly now about weaknesses in utilitarianism. First, many people think that utilitarianism asks too much of us, that it makes excessive demands. And the reason is very simple. It is a maximizing principle. Utilitarianism asks you every minute of every day to maximize everyone's utility. And potentially what that means is a demand of great sacrifices from you simply in order to maximize utility. To take a simple example, there would be many circumstances under which a sacrifice of one person's bodily organs, such as kidneys, could be donated to another person and achieve a maximization in that circumstance of benefits. And that could be true not just when you die, but also while you're still alive. Now, if utilitarianism makes such demands, and it certainly does seem in a pure utilitarianism that it does, then it looks like it demands too much in the way of sacrifices. Second, People raise questions about whether utilitarianism permits injustice and the violations of rights. This is a question not about whether it demands too much, but about whether it permits too much. And here the point is a pretty simple one, and one that any of you familiar with the basics of political theory would already have encountered. If you give tremendous power to the majority, you're maximizing on some kind of a majoritarian principle, or something like a majoritarian principle, at least an aggregative or collective principle, then you're very likely to pay too little attention to individuals and particularly to minorities. So the more you have a collectivist philosophy, and that certainly looks like what you have in utilitarianism, the more likely you will be to override or to ignore individual rights. We'll see more of this, I believe, when we come to the lecture on justice. Third, this question of impartiality bothers a lot of people. And the question arises, does utilitarianism ask too much, again, in the way of impartiality? Let me try to provoke you on this question by giving you an example that's not presented as a counterexample by those who are opposed to utilitarianism, but by a utilitarian himself. An ardent and uncompromising utilitarian of the late 18th century and early 19th century named William Godwin. Godwin repudiated any action and any principle that had anything other than what he called the general welfare as its goal. He offered a striking example that many people have commented on over the years of the French archbishop and author Francois Fenelon. Suppose there's a fire, says Godwin, and you can either save the archbishop or you can save the archbishop's chambermaid. The catch here is the archbishop's chambermaid turns out to be your mother. Which choice ought you to make, says Godwin? And in his judgment, the matter is crystal clear. You must save the archbishop because of the archbishop's potential for good works. The fact of a lifelong and loving relationship between you and your mother, Godwin argues, is irrelevant. Unless, he said in later editions, having encountered some pretty hostile objections, as you can imagine, unless, he says, the cultivation of domestic affections could themselves be construed as contributing in an overriding way to the general welfare. Not an implausible guess, actually. Now, this raises in a profound way questions about whether or not in all circumstances, particularly those involving intimates, the principle of utility is the right kind of principle, and also, even more generally, whether you want any kind of an impartial principle to be operative in those circumstances. All right, the second type of theory I'd like to take up is the Kantian moral theory, which I describe as a duty-based theory. Now, utilitarianism is in a way duty-based theory too, but here you have something much more like a pure duty-based theory for reasons that I'll try to explain. For Kantians, and Kant in particular, rightness or wrongness of actions is determined not by their consequences. And this is so no matter what the consequences are. For example, if physician-assisted suicide is morally wrong from a Kantian perspective, if it is, let's just suppose for a minute it is, then it is categorically wrong, and it would be wrong even if not so assisting a person meant horrible pain for that person. Indeed, on a pure Kantian theory, if not doing so meant the destruction of the world, that would be irrelevant. Moral questions have to do not with consequences, but rather with what your duty is, and duty comes in the Kantian system from categorical rules. It is a strict duty from principle philosophy. Kant emphasizes motivation for the sake of duty, and not, as he puts it, for any other reason. So it's not good enough in his view that one performs correct actions. It's not even good enough in his view that one performs correct actions knowing that they are correct actions, because one could have as an underlying motive, let's say, self-interested reasons. What one must do to act morally is to act from duty, which is a matter of categorical rules. And duty can never be overridden or ignored in any circumstance if one is to be a moral actor. Your duty does not counsel you about what is the right thing to do. Your duty demands that you do what is the right thing to do. And to be motivated on any other basis is to be, from a Kantian account, improperly motivated. Now, one formulation of what's called Kant's categorical imperative, there's more than one formulation, but one formulation has been particularly influential in biomedical ethics, and it gets back to the example that I gave you of the defenders of children. The defenders of children in the National Commission were in effect operating on this Kantian moral principle, as they themselves were often concerned to point out. Kant words the principle as follows: one must act to treat every person as an end and never as a means only. Now you can see right away in the context of a Kantian philosophy how anti-utilitarian this principle is. It wants to say not only is this the right principle, but it is the right principle irrespective of the ends or consequences that are at stake. To give a simple example, Kant's principle does not mean that we cannot use research subject in non-therapeutic research. Kant doesn't mean that at all. But it does mean that we cannot use them without their consent, and that the consent cannot be obtained manipulatively. So you can see right away that on a pure Kantian account, there are grave problems about how you might be able to use children in research. Or, in fact, there are pretty grave problems about a great many ways in which we treat children on the Kantian account. Now, like utilitarianism, Kantianism has a number of weaknesses, and I want to point out a couple of weaknesses in this account as well. First of all, there is a problem in a pure Kantian theory about conflicting obligations. Because Kant makes all moral rules and all obligations coming from them categorical or absolute, when conflicts arise, you promise to do one thing, but then another thing comes up and you can't do what you promised to do, but the other thing is morally of very great significance. What do you do in that circumstance? Well, Kant seems to say, because you have two duties that are in conflict, that you must do both, and that is an obvious incoherent. I mean, one cannot do the impossible. So if there is no way to get yourself off the hook of a categorical duty without committing a wrong, there does seem to be something seriously wrong with the theory. Now, generalizing just a little bit, that is going to be a problem for any account of ethics that offers absolutist principles unless there's an order to the absoluteness. Now, there's one absolute principle, and then anything else would be ordered under that principle so that that principle overrides it. Now, if Kant had a theory like that, obviously he would be all right if he could prioritize the obligations. But he doesn't ever seriously consider this question and doesn't seem to have any easy way out of this problem. Secondly, and nowadays I think an even more significant question, is whether something like the Kantian model at all captures the larger picture of morality. It may capture it very nicely for a restricted range of circumstances, but how does it fare in trying to capture the larger picture of morality? Kant's theory is obviously built because of the notion of categorical demands, or the categorical imperative, on a picture of lawful relationships. It looks very much like he's modeled ethics on law. And one could raise real questions, and many people have, about whether or not the staples of laws, like contracts, let's say, which bring into the picture freedom and choice and equality, contract itself and the like, deserve to be elevated to the central position in ethics. Now, here the question is, why use a categorical, legalistic model for ethics when so much of morality seems to suggest a different orientation? Among friends and intimates, for example, we rarely think of ethics in terms of law or contract or absolute and categorical rules. And yet we have no trouble thinking about our moral responsibilities in those contexts. This suggests then that Kant's theory, and probably also utilitarianism as well, is better suited for a set of relationships among strangers than it is for a set of relationships among friends and intimates. If so, then it would seem Kantian models, and again probably utilitarian models too, need supplementation by a broader vision of morality that covers our intimate relationships, our benevolent dispositions, social forms of cooperation, and the like. Now, I've only scratched the surface of utilitarian and Kantian theories, but now I want to turn to what I described earlier as the challenger theories. These challenger theories, for all of their differences, have a common complaint about both utilitarian and Kantian theories. They say, look, these theories are both based on duty. Let's try to get away from a duty-based theory and take some broader perspective on the moral life. An important theory, which we'll take a look at later in the week, is character ethics, or a virtue-based account. Now, virtue consists in properly motivated dispositions and characteristic desires to perform actions, and therefore is not reducible to a rule of obligation. For example, as a professional, you are obligated only to perform a certain range of actions. You are not obligated to have certain desires or certain motives in performing those actions. You are obligated to do certain things for patients, but you are not obligated to feel compassion or to be motivated from sympathy in dealing with those patients. And yet, we care morally about the source of a person's motivations, and especially about their characteristic motivations and desires. Persons who are motivated by compassion and friendship and personal affection meet our approbation when others who act in the same way, but from different motives, would not meet our approbation. To speak of a good action, such as telling patients the truth, is usually only elliptical for our evaluation of the motive or the desire that underlies the action. The motive, say, of caring that the patient receive adequate and proper information. Persons who characteristically perform morally right actions without a set of motives and desires are not morally virtuous. And this is so even if they perform the morally right action, and even if they always perform the morally right action. In other words, you could have people who 100% of the time perform the morally right action, and yet they would not be virtuous. And that's because they lack the right forms of motivation and the structures of desires commensurate with those motivations. Virtue theory is particularly important, I think, in a healthcare context, because a morally good person with the right motives is more likely to discern what should be done and more likely to be motivated to perform the right action in that circumstance. The person who simply follows rules of obligation and otherwise shows no special moral character may not even be trustworthy. That is to say, that's a person who could let us down at any time. Now, despite this attractiveness, and I do think it's a very attractive moral theory, virtue theory, it too encounters certain problems. One is it really all that different, or should it be disengaged from principle-based or duty-based type theories? Or is there some kind of an essential reliance on principles? How could we know which kinds of traits to encourage in persons or to give our approbation to in persons unless we already subscribed to some general principles of action? The question thus arises whether a virtue theory should, or even conceivably could be, separated from a theory with normative principles. After all, if you cut it completely free from any kind of impartial theory or objective principles or something of that order, then people seem free simply to go with their own set of motivations and desires and that which receives approbation. But we know that very often those desires can take us in an all too partial direction that needs correction by impartial principles. This suggests then that though virtue theory may be very important, it wouldn't be an appropriate theory to accept apart from some kind of set of principles or duty-based account. Secondly, there are vast areas of the moral life that do not appear properly frameable in the language of virtue theory or properly controlled by having the right dispositions. For example, when strangers meet in many circumstances, such as a patient's encounter with an anesthesiologist just before surgery. Character judgments will often play a much less significant role than norms that express right relationships, right procedures, a right action of some sort, such as consent procedures or committee review. The same is true in the enforcement of institutional rules and in the making of public policy. Dispensing then with rules of obligation and even sanctions for violations, while relying exclusively on the virtues, would be a serious and unwarranted loss in the moral life. Now, I think when Ed Pellegrino talks to you later this week about virtue theory, he will not disagree with this complaint. The question is, how do you put the two together? And I imagine that he will be addressing that. Now, the next theory I want to take up is the ethics of care, which is a relatively new theory. It has had a particularly deep impact in some feminist writings and also in nursing ethics, though it's had a much broader appeal than that, but it's had particularly important impact in both of those areas. Proponents of the ethics of care typically reject the Kantian model with particular sternness. They think that the Kantian model leads you to look at duties that autonomous agents have, rather than looking at selves in a relational network of responsibilities. What about families? What about communal decision-making? As those who espouse the ethics of care see it, these are often very intimate and in very intimate contexts. Contracts, universal laws, and the like don't quite seem to get it straight. Consider again the problem of impartial principles. This criterion of a distanced fairness makes eminently good sense if you're in the context, let's say, of courts of law. But from the perspective of the ethics of care, it cuts away too much of morality in order to get at a standpoint of detached fairness, which seems really suitable only for certain types of moral relationships, such as those when people truly interact as equals. But in many contexts, moral contexts, people do not interact as equals. So traditional accounts of detachment, which you find in both utilitarian and Kantian theories, seem to block forms of attachment that might be formed with other persons. In the absence of public and institutional constraints, then, partiality towards others from this perspective is not only morally permissible, it is actually the expected norm of interaction and really is an ineliminable feature of the human condition. Now, those in the ethics of care, obviously from what we've said so far, have a certain aversion to principles, a principle-based account, and in particular to impartial principles. Let me say something a little bit more about that. As long as principles are sufficiently flexible that they allow room for you to make judgments and not to be constrained in the way in which you seem constrained in a Kantian theory by those principles, someone who's devoted to the ethics of care would have no problems with principles. At the same time, they insist that principles are often irrelevant, unproductive, ineffectual, and much too constrictive in the moral life. They maintain that many forms of human relationships involve people who are vulnerable, dependent, ill, and frail, and that in these circumstances, desirable moral responses almost invariably come not from one's understanding of one's duty or applying a principle, but actually from other forms of human responsiveness. Now, the ethics of care has, as I say, had a deep impact in certain areas, and there's no doubt that there's a lot to it. But again, there are some questions that ought to be raised. The first, and a very important one, I think, is whether too much of morality is left out in this account. In other words, if the idea of the account is to give you a comprehensive picture of the moral life, again, it really is a general moral theory, you surely would have grave reservations about giving up in all contexts your impartial principles. Imagine, for example, in a circumstance of justice, where justice was your most operative concern. You surely would want impartial principles of justice to be operative in those contexts. Now, this is hardly precluded by an ethics of care. Somebody in the ethics of care can say, well, surely we want to accommodate justice when we're in a justice-based context. But if you make a move in that direction, then the real concern is whether you can incorporate those principles and make it coherent with an ethics of care, or whether or not what happens in that context is the ethics of care then gets subsumed under some much larger picture. In short, can someone who wants to make the ethics of care the paradigm of an ethical theory incorporate impartial principles and still have what one started off with as a theory? Secondly, as is recorded in your text, and I'll be brief about this, though the ethics of care arose largely in a context of feminist writings, a number of feminists recently have expressed grave reservations about the ethics of care. This is discussed a little bit in your text on pages 91 and 92. The idea here is a rather simple one. If you develop a moral theory that emphasizes the ethics of care, and you put that forward as your basic account, then what it may lead to is an exploitation of precisely those people who have in the past exhibited that they are best at the ethics of care, namely women. So you may give them caregiving roles, particularly in more subsidiary contexts, which is where care-based relationships are often found, where you overlook in that regard again, justice-based considerations. You overlook oppression, you overlook dominance and the like. So what several recent feminists have said is don't expunge principles of justice, don't expunge rights and the like from your account, precisely because in many circumstances where you might appeal to the ethics of care, you will need to preserve those notions. All right, finally, among the alternative types of theory, there is what is now commonly called casuistry, an approach that looks basically at particular cases and that has had a deep impact in a number of medical schools in this country that have concentrations or programs in biomedical ethics. Now, I think that casuistry needs to be understood in part, the appeal of casuistry needs to be understood in part because, again, of dissatisfaction with contemporary and traditional moral theories like Kantian and utilitarian theories. Casuists are particularly distressed by the classical conception that a moral theory is a unified theory with impartial and universal principles that make a moral theory look very much like a scientific theory, a pure theory, as it were, rather than just an applied theory. Now, there can be no doubt that there is a certain mentality of this sort in the history of ethics. Build a system. Don't worry too much about the applications, because after all, what you want is to devise a theory of the moral life. And it is just that. It is a theory. It is not an attempt to live the moral life, but to give a theory of the moral life. Now, the casuist wants to say, look, ethics is not a science in this respect. It is not even a theory on this model. Ethics is a set of practices, maxims, judgments made in contexts. It relies on tradition, wisdom, prudence, and the like. So casuists insist that some forms of moral reasoning make no appeal to principles or rules or rights or virtues at all. Now, they need not deny that those play some role in the moral life, but they do want to say that they're very far from capturing the way in which we practically deliberate in a great many contexts. They want to say what we often do is tell a story or have a particularly important narrative that's a powerful one before us, and we reason from that story or narrative. We use paradigm cases, they want to say. Cases are very important in medicine, they're very important in law, they're very important in business. So we educate people. Similarly, they want to say in ethics, we educate people through paradigm cases and we think through paradigm cases without any appeal to principles or virtues or any of the other categories that we've discussed thus far. Now, it does not follow from this vision that casuists need to be hostile to all forms of principles, and the more moderate among the casuists say precisely this. It does mean, though, that you wouldn't want to put principles forward as your basic tool of practical deliberation. Principles can be the result of the outcome of other practical deliberations once you have your paradigm cases pretty well set up and you understand how to reason from those paradigm cases, because principles become a kind of shorthand to express the way you've struggled over the cases. In other words, once you have your judgments more or less straight about a range of cases, you can formulate those judgments as principles. But that's just a convenient shorthand way of using an abstraction. The abstraction is not the basic tool that got you where you are, and in many circumstances, it is not the basic tool of reasoning. Now, casuistry, like the other theories, has certain weaknesses. One is exactly how do you use cases, and exactly what do they mean by a case. Casuists often write as if cases are basic. Now, usually by a case, they mean a paradigm case, though sometimes they seem to suggest that just cases. You use cases and you reason from the cases. But think about the problem in this way. If you're to move constructively from this case to the next case, and then from these two cases to the next case, by some kind of order or precedence that's set up among the cases, what do you carry from one case to the next? Well, it seems that you carry some kind of a norm that tells you what you should do and what's relevant in the one case that can be carried to the next case. Well, the question then arises, isn't that just some kind of rule or principle? And if it is, then what really have you achieved in a casuistry by appealing to cases or paradigm cases? It doesn't look like those cases are in the end really very different from principles or rules, because what's built into the case, what makes it a paradigm case, we might say, is precisely that it has deeply embedded in it some kind of a principle or rule. But there are other problems for casuists as well. How does justification occur in casuistry? How do you know that your judgment is justified when you carry one case into the next circumstance and you apply that case? Casuists insist that we often reason by analogy. We take something from the first case that is analogous to what we meet in the second case. But there are many points of analogies that can be made in cases. And therefore, potentially, in a pure casuistry, there could be many different right answers and no real way to check up on what's a right answer versus a wrong answer. So the point is, without some kind of a stable framework that informs how you pick cases and what you pick out of cases, it looks like you just may not have enough built into your moral theory. Okay, finally, as I said earlier, I would like to say something about principle-based accounts, as they're often called, and also about certain attacks on principles. And here I'm trying to explicate a little bit, giving you the background of the account that's found in your text. This afternoon I'll say a little bit more about this. I'll talk in particular about what is called principlism in particular criticisms of the theory, but here I'm just trying to lay the general account out. Let me say something in the way of historical background to begin. Principles that could be understood with relative ease by the members of various disciplines — I'm going to assume that this audience comes from many different disciplines and you'd be a perfect example — you need some way to be able to talk together when you get together to talk about moral problems. And this notion of having something that we all share in common figured very prominently in the development of biomedical ethics during the 1970s and the early 1980s, which was the time at which Jim Childress and I wrote the first edition of our book. Principles were used primarily to present frameworks of evaluative assumptions so that they could be used by people from a diverse array of professional backgrounds and training. The distilled morality that's found in a principle, and that's really what it is, you distill a lot of morality down to a single abstraction, provided a serviceable group of norms for analyzing many different types of moral problems. In effect, principles gave the embryonic field of bioethics, and it was very embryonic in the, say, early to middle 1970s, it gave it a kind of shared set of norms to operate with, and at the same time gave it a kind of method for formulating and attacking its problems. So that was the idea of what a framework of principles would do. However, beginning in the mid-1980s or so, the paradigm of a system of principles as adequate for bioethics began to be aggressively challenged, and several alternatives were presented. casuistry being among the leading of those alternatives. Now, my view is the following. These alternatives and the dialogue that has come from the presentation of these alternatives ought to be welcomed in bioethics because they have, and I'm quite serious about this, they have improved the range and the precision and the quality of thought in the field. They've led to more of a focus on method. How do you do bioethics? What can you reasonably expect to achieve in doing bioethics? And they've particularly, I think, pushed along what was an even more embryonic field back in the 70s, which was clinical ethics, which has its own set of concerns and has probably been helped out more than any other area by these later developments. The question can reasonably be raised whether or not these alternative approaches replace principles. If replace here means displace. And I'll be concerned to explain today, not only this lecture but the one this afternoon, why for the most part I think the two are thoroughly compatible. In fact, my own view is that you don't have to pick and choose among these moral theories, say this is mine, I'm going to reject all of the others, because I think there's a great deal to be said for a lot of things in all of these theories. The question is, how much of them can you put together coherently? Now, the principle-based approach that Jim Childress and I developed in Principles of Biomedical Ethics has often been called the four principles approach. Here, moral principles are understood as standards of conduct on which many other moral claims and judgments depend. As such, a principle is an essential norm in a system of moral thought, forming the basis of moral thinking in that area. Now, to say that it's the basis is certainly not to say you can do all of your thinking by reference to these principles. And it is a great mistake to understand the framework in that way, is if you can take these very abstract principles and just apply them to a case and get some kind of an answer. And as the day goes along, I'll try to explain a little bit why you cannot do that. But for them to be fundamental or basic in some respect is the idea, and for them to provide a framework by which you can situate the various ethically relevant components in a case that comes before you, that is the idea. Now, Childress and I defend the view that these principles and related rules, insofar as they assert obligations, and they do, should be conceived neither as rules of thumb nor as absolute prescriptions of, say, a Kantian variety. Rather, they express firm obligations, things that you must do in your actions or must not do in your actions if they're prohibitive. Suppose, for example, that you promise to be a consultant. You're going to consult on a case with somebody. Having promised, therefore, you are obligated to consult because you're obligated to keep your promises. But when you get into the case, you find that you have a serious conflict of interest, which obligates you not to express an opinion in this case. Here, the obligation to avoid conflict of interest overrides the obligation to keep your promise. Sometimes a balance between these two norms can be found, and so you engage in balancing. Perhaps, let's say, you can consult on some part of the case, but not on other parts of the case. But often, one norm simply overrides the others. For example, the obligation to avoid a conflict of interest often seems to override whatever other obligation you might have in the circumstance. This obviously will depend on the context. Now, the idea of these principles is something like that. They present obligations that are incumbent upon you until some circumstance, until you meet another obligation, in which case one of the obligations may have to yield, or you may have to take some portion of the one obligation in a balancing act and some portion of the other obligation, and you can only live up to some piece of what you initially took to be your obligation. The overriding of one obligation by another seems to many people to be precariously flexible in the moral life. Obviously, a Kantian is going to think that. It seems to lack backbone, as if your obligations can somehow magically be waved away in a circumstance just by another obligation arising. But in ethics, I think there is no escape from the exercise of judgment. There's really no escape from a context in which obligations will conflict, and in those circumstances, weighing and balancing. And Jim and I have thought now through 4 editions in which we've met some hostile critics often of the Kantian stripe, who think that there really is no backbone in these principles, that there really is no way to put forward a principle-based account unless you allow this kind of flexibility and latitude for judgment. Now, people often ask, where do these principles originate? Where do you get them? In chapters 1 and 2 of the book, Jim and I try to answer this question as best we can. We try to answer it both historically and philosophically. Let me say something here just to give you an orientation, and a very synoptic one at that expresses not the philosophical account, which is a bit turgid in chapter 1, but at least the historical account. I think the principles come from both the common morality of the larger society and from the common morality of the traditions that have been present in biomedicine. For many years now, I have encountered an immense skepticism from many people about this notion of the common morality. Many people seem so convinced that our culture is dominated by a secular pluralism that they think we believe nothing that gives us a common starting point. Now, if you think that, then I think you will not be very sympathetic with what Jim and I are arguing. I think, though, that that is a great mistake. I think that even the most pluralistic and multicultural contexts and international contexts offer a common morality that gives us a standpoint from which we can begin. Now, I certainly would emphasize begin, because there certainly will be many conflicts along the way where the sailing is not so smooth, but I am only talking about beginning points. Now, my belief is predicated on the view that there exists, not in the minds now of a philosopher, but in all cultures worthy of the name, a common morality of practices and beliefs. This is a morality of keeping your promises and agreements, being honest and truthful, treating people equally where they merit equal treatment, not punishing the innocent, not causing harm to others, being faithful to your friends, not breaking the law, not neglecting your professional duties, not depriving people of freedom, being respectful of people who have legitimate authority, and so on. And we could go on and on and on with the different ingredients that constitute what I'm referring to here as the common morality. This is a morality that I think all reasonable persons, no matter their source or origin, share and acknowledge. Those who act against these norms simply act immorally. They do not have another morality, as it is sometimes put, whatever that might mean. Now, these norms are obviously based on social conventions and historical traditions, rather than philosophical systems. Philosophical systems start with them. They don't create them. Nonetheless, they must be incorporated in any philosophical account of ethics worthy of the name, or else, in my judgment, that account will simply be defective. These are, we might say, the foundational and threshold conditions of any philosophical ethics. Similarly, I think, traditions of medical, nursing, public health, and research ethics supply norms and accounts of professional virtues, as well as statements of obligations and rights. These have sometimes been transmitted through codes and learned writings on ethics, which for centuries have been framed as professional commitments to shield patients from harm and to provide medical care and other benefits. Now, here I'm speaking of professional ethics built into institutionalized traditions and practices. For example, the culture of physician conduct acknowledges many role responsibilities and professional goals, as I think Ed Pellegrino is likely again to have some discourse with you about later this week. These traditions internally present understandings of obligations and virtues that have been adapted over decades or centuries for professional practice. Primarily, they are focused on what I will this afternoon discuss as obligations of non-maleficence and beneficence. So it is then the two together, the common morality of society and the common morality of the health professions, that provide the basic initial content for a biomedical ethics. I emphasize, though, that this is only the beginning point. It is a necessary, but it is very far from a sufficient condition of an adequate biomedical ethics. These traditions, we might say, supply the considered judgments that are our shared roots, but they do not give us much more than the roots. When you hear the later lectures in this course, I think you will see why they would not by themselves be sufficient. Let me now conclude. Studying a trail of rival, inconsistent moral theories would be of little use for biomedical ethics. However, if there are elements that can be extracted from each of these approaches that helps us understand and bring unity to the moral life, and then helps us with practice or practical judgments, then each type of theory may be of service to us. Those of you who have read widely in contemporary biomedical ethics know that appeals springing from the several different types of ethical theory that we've now surveyed are common. There are many consequentialist appeals, many Kantian appeals, many invocations of virtue, many appeals to the ethics of care and to casuistry, and so on. But an ethical theory or general framework or system gives you only, as I've now harped upon several times, a beginning and a broad orientation to moral thinking. It does not give you a definitive and full body of principles and prescriptions for practical decision-making. No ethical theory can be determinate enough to dictate policies or courses of action in the difficult cases. And I promise you that I will return to this theme this afternoon. Thank you very much. Did you wish to? 7 minutes for discussion. As you wish. Do we have some questions? I believe Leroy was inviting questions. I'm sure this audience must have some questions. You don't have to stand at the microphone. Yes, please.
Could you say a few words about the relationship of technology, emerging technology, the problems of technology in relationship to your final discussion about principles that Lord guide that become
Are you thinking about how in emerging biotechnologies very often we're caught unawares? We don't have practices and traditions that will give us something like determinative principles. Is that the? I think that's certainly right. It's again one reason for appreciating the importance of the abstractness in principles and rules and the way in which judgment is required to bring them to bear on new cases. I think it's not so much a question of its being emerging biotechnologies, although it is often more dramatic in that area. It's a question of novel circumstances arising. And you can have novel circumstance arise in, let's say, an intensive care unit or whatever. And if one thought what ethics is some kind of a large body of principles and rules and maxims and judgments and policies and the like, so that all you have to do when some circumstance arises is slot that circumstance under this operative rule, I think it would be a great mistake. You have to exercise judgment. You have to be prepared to find yourself, let's say when you're doing committee review, in circumstances in which you simply get new cases that don't look very much like the cases that you've seen before, and then you have to figure out what to do with it. Now, to have a framework of principles and rules readily available is, I think, essential. Otherwise, you're just lost. You don't even know how to talk to the person next to you on the table. It doesn't mean, though, that you can very quickly achieve a resolution or a consensus or something like that merely because you have a shared framework of principles that you take into that deliberation. Very often, I think you can't. You're like the National Commission example that I gave you. You're going to have 2 dissenting members. And as far as I'm concerned, that's just the way it is in the moral life. Yes?
When you're talking about the common principles unless they do not warrant treatment, when would a person not warrant?
Yeah, that's a real complicated question that I'd like to put off for the lecture on justice because it is one of the major questions about the so-called formal principle of justice. And it really is an enormous question because it raises questions about the relevance of any property that you would land upon to fill in what is often called, coming out of Aristotle's writings, the principle of formal equality. And that maxim, which virtually everyone accepts, says that you have to treat equals equally, but you may treat unequals unequally. So then the question becomes, well, what are the properties that you look for when you're looking for equality, and what are the properties that you're looking for when you look for inequalities? And one of the reasons that I stated it in the way in which I stated it, which you picked up on quite nicely, is if you try to be more specific than that, you will not find something present in the common morality, as I'm calling it, that sanctions it. Now you might say, well, if that's the case, though, what good is the common morality? Well, it's good only that far. It's only good so far as it can give you principles that are so deeply embedded that they become a part of everyone's shared way of life. We are going to fragment, not only with this principle that you land upon and land upon quite rightly, but on any of those principles or rules that I gave you from common morality traditions. And basically the problem is going to be the same in each case. Can you get a set of relevant properties and get agreement upon those relevant properties as being the ones to invoke in this particular circumstance or this particular range of cases? Now, if you want to give me a particular example, I could try to do better than that, but I think in terms of the sort of abstract way it comes out of the common morality, that's probably the best that I can do for you. I don't think there's any way this is not going to come back in the lecture on justice, so you can hound the person who gives that lecture. Yes? To what?
First world. Too individualistic, too much representing a view of the world that is a consequence of affluence and a number of things. And then in other contexts, the concept of communitarism, collectivism, other more non-individualistic approaches are being left out. And it seems like a recipe, okay, like a checkout list, and then I solve our problem. This is particularly interesting in other countries where you try to go with the principle. And this is kind of first reaction that you find in many people from different professions.
Yeah, I think that's a bad rap, basically. There's nothing in this body of principles that I'm defending anyway, and I think not very much in most accounts of contemporary biomedical ethics that make it necessarily individualist as a larger picture, or that, say, rule out possibilities for a communitarian emphasis, which is what I think you're looking for. What is true is if you take some of the principles, like, for example, the principle of respect for autonomy, and you make that your overriding principle, so that other more communitarian emphases, like considerations of justice and beneficence in particular, but also non-maleficence, don't get the same treatment that respect for autonomy does, then you will have an account that is highly individualist and the like. I think that the reactions that you're talking about are reactions that pick up on a couple of things. One, in theory, it's a theory like that developed by Tristram Engelhardt that just make the principle of respect for autonomy the principle. That there is no other principle that stands on an equal level. So you get a highly individualistic ethical theory. That's one thing. Then there is the correlate of that in particular contexts of the practice of biomedical ethics, such as insisting upon an individual informed consent for every procedure or every move that you make. As if the healthcare system in every country had an infinite amount of time to make great explanations to utterly ignorant people about what kind of procedures that you're using, and absolutely insists upon that, or otherwise you're described as being immoral. Now, that's where I think this reputation arises, and there's no doubt you're quite right. It's widespread at the present time. But if you look at the larger picture of what comes out of even a utilitarian tradition is a collectivist system. It is not a highly individualistic system. It is true that Mill himself defended a particularly strong principle of freedom and autonomy, Nonetheless, utilitarianism does not preclude collectivist accounts, and many of these types of theories that I've talked about not only don't preclude them, but advance them as being very important. Now, please.
What happens when you have the introduction of another sphere of ethics, say business ethics,
Yeah.
into medicine? Different way of thinking is a set of standards. What happens when now we're told that medicine is a business, and by implication,
Yeah.
a different set of ethics concepts?
Well, I'm glad you raised that because I am going to talk about that just a little bit this afternoon. I'm going to give you an example of it, but let me be brief here. I don't think there's any inconsistency whatsoever between medical ethics and business ethics. I do think, as you say, that they arise from different contexts and they have different emphases. And in the world of biotechnology and research ethics and commercial products and the like, they often encounter one another, and it requires creative attempts to adjudicate those differences. But I don't think it's intrinsically any different than other forms of conflict that we meet internal to business ethics or internal to biomedical ethics. And I will say a little bit more about that this afternoon. One more question, or are you calling a halt? One more. Please.
The way you describe the process of your ethical theory and the interaction, is that a variation on Normative?
Well, a lot of people have asked me whether or not a Habermasian theory is compatible, let's say, with the kind of account that I've given. I think I don't have a terribly good answer to give you except to say I don't see any deep incompatibility. On the other hand, it hardly supplies something like the foundations of the account. I mean, I wouldn't say that it's incompatible, but I would say it's somewhat distant from what I gave you as the foundations of the framework, namely the common morality of society and the common morality and the history of the healthcare professions. Leroy's going to call a halt. I shall welcome seeing you again this afternoon. Thank you.